But the last time I spoke on this issue, Minister, you described my contribution as being bizarre and extraordinary. So I hope that my contribution is a bit more to your liking today. First of all, I want to inform the House that on the anniversary of the election of Donald Trump on the 8th of November in Liberty Hall, there will be an event called Irish Stand, which will be raising funds directly for young people in direct provision. There's a youth project that Irish Refugee Council are involved in, and it's actually in danger of closure. So the event that night, which performers such as Senator Francis Black and others will be performing that night in an effort to raise funds for that project on the 8th of November, which I think is a moment in time a year ago where everybody felt a little bit colder, that the world was just that little bit less generous. On this particular issue, Minister, I am very critical of this government's attitude towards this particular issue. You know this stems from the draft programme for government in which there was a sentence written in black and white, which I observed myself and welcomed at the time, which said that the government will implement the recommendations of the McMahon report. And when the actual programme for government came out, that sentence had been deleted. So I don't know who deleted it. I don't know if it was a political figure. I don't know if it was somebody within your department. But certainly it was no longer there. So that commitment was no longer in evidence. Now, it is, as Senator Norris quite rightly said, to be welcomed that you today have announced that the government will move to enable people in the asylum system, not all of which are in direct provision, but people in the asylum system can access the labour force. But again, has been stated, that is on foot of a Supreme Court judgment and not anything that came from within the government. I think what we need to move towards, Minister, and I hope you agree with me, and I hope you don't consider this statement to be bizarre or extraordinary, is that people within the system will spend no more than 6 months. And I think if that was the situation, I think we could stand over the system as it is. It's very difficult to stand over a system that allows people to languish in these centres for a prolonged period of time. I visited many of these centres. I'm sure you have yourself, Minister. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to do so. I know Minister Stanton has visited a huge number of these centres, and the stench of desperation, and particularly for children, is something that is going to live with this country for an awful long time. So that aspiration of having a very short period of time, a very short period of turnover time in any particular centre is something that has to be an aspiration, I think, for Government, Minister. I do understand that the housing shortage is adding to those problems, and I do know that there are community welfare officers around the country who are dealing proactively with people in direct provision who have their papers who wish to move on. The numbers have gone down of long-stay residents in the system. I know from 2015 to 2017 there was a 1,500 reduction in the numbers of people, long-stay residents within the system over 3 years. However, this should never have been allowed to come to this point. This system should have been reviewed 5 years within its existence in 2005, or 10 years into its existence in 2010. It wasn't until we had an agreement between Fine Gael and Labour in 2014 that this system finally came to be properly reviewed and properly reformed. But again, the programme for government decided to delete that sentence. I didn't see any mention of this in the confidence and supply arrangement between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Unless I'm greatly mistaken, I don't remember in then candidate and now Taoiseach Varadkar's manifesto to the nation as to why he wants to lead us, was there any mention of this particular issue either. But I think it is important that this chamber, of all chambers in this state, and particularly in this Oireachtas, has consistently and constantly raised this issue and consistently and constantly tried to ensure that from a cross-party basis, regardless of our political background, that we are keeping this issue on to the forefront of our minds, and that we are wanted to engage with you and to have debates on the progress of the McMahon report. And Judge Brian McMahon is quite critical of government inaction on the implementation of his report. And I'll say once more again, which I know you found, again, this comment extraordinary last time, but this was not a report that was sent out to consultants and independently written and then handed back to government. This is a report that was signed off on by department officials. And it was a report that was negotiated between department officials who were sitting on the working group and NGOs. So sometimes you get a report which has been done by an expert group and hand it back to government. And people can't dismiss it as being too idealistic or too ideological or not in the real world. This was a report which was negotiated and argued and tossed over and back, and when it was signed off upon, the understanding was that it was signed off upon with the absolute expectation that it would be implemented to the letter, because any problem that the department may have had with any of the recommendations had already been cited, had already been spoken about, had already been argued over and back. And while many of the NGOs who would stake their reputations on the line in going with the report because they had a mandate to end direct provision, and the report that was published very much went less than that, they were willing to go with the report because they expected it to be implemented in its entirety. And I've said before, and I'll say it to you again, Minister, if I was a member of any of the NGOs which stayed with that process, and not all of them did, one of them walked away, if I was a member of any of those NGOs with that mandate to end direct provision, who signed off on a report, who went short of ending direct provision, in good faith, I don't know if I would have the heart to deal with the Department of Justice again. Because they went with a process in good faith, in trust that the situation will be enhanced or improved, and more than 2 years later, we're still debating over whether or how many of the recommendations have been brought to fruition. So, Minister, can we, at the very least, have the aspiration that nobody in this system will spend more than 6 months in a direct provision centre? Can we ensure that the long-stay residents are moved out of the system? Can we ensure that the oversight that's been asked for which we've begun to roll out, I have to acknowledge that, can be continued?
1 minute.
And can we ensure, Minister, that when it comes to the totality of the report being implemented, that we don't argue over what percentage of recommendations have been implemented and which ones haven't? Because the aspiration of what we're trying to achieve shouldn't really be a party political point-scoring exercise. It really shouldn't. It should actually be what we're trying to achieve for children who are in our care. And these children are in our care, and they're in our country, and they expect an awful lot better from the country of 100,000 Balkans.
Thanks.